Hello and welcome. Much of this lecture will cover material found in Chapter 2 of Richard Rowson's Working Ethics. As we left off with the previous lecture, we found that there will be challenges and difficulties faced with trying to find some basis for a true and objective ethics. And really, there's very little confidence that any sort of truth or objective basis will be found. Even among philosophers whose careers are spent searching for truth, they have a difficult time agreeing on the source of ethics, and especially on ethical values and principles. So if even philosophers disagree about the matter, what are we to do? Well, while foundations may be doubtful, convergence on general principles, rules, and ideals may still be possible. So let's take a look in this chapter at what some of the implications are for the lack of consensus on moral truth. And we're going to first talk about relativism, and then we'll talk about its opposite approach, which is objectivism, and then examine some limitations with both of those. So what are the implications of the lack of consensus on moral truth? Well, it might be tempting to say, well, there's no ethical reason then to prefer one foundation of ethics over any others. There may be non-ethical reasons like my particular faith, or your experience, or logic, or pragmatics, what works, or simply what's comfortable or familiar. And that those are sufficient for our purposes. They serve, and they allow me to function well, they allow you to function well, and so on. And so then any basis for such preference would, of course, then itself be a point of contention. My values may not be your values, my faith may not be your faith, your experience is different from mine, especially in the details. Logic, well, hopefully we don't disagree about what logic entails, but whether logic should be the basis for ethics is a point of contention. Whether pragmatics, or what works, should be the basis for ethics is also contentious. And of course, what's comfortable for me may not be comfortable for you. And of course, we could also say, well, why should comfort be the basis for ethics? Isn't ethics supposed to challenge us out of our comfort zones and get us to think beyond what's just familiar to us? All right, well, let's take a look at ethical relativism because it jumps into this gap really nicely. Primarily, the evidence that supports ethical relativism is the fact of moral disagreement. We disagree about moral standards and values, and historically this is the case between societies, between cultures, between historical periods even, as well as between individuals who disagree about moral standards. I believe it might be wrong to pull the heads off of kittens. You, however, might believe it's right to pull the heads off of kittens. And how are we ever going to decide this? Well, ethical relativism tells us there's no basis for deciding. The lack of agreement on moral standards is taken as evidence that there are no moral standards apart from what a particular society, culture, group, or individual adopts to govern their own and, of course, others' conduct. So there may be no basis for us to decide who's right and who's wrong, and ethical relativism says that's just the fact of the matter, so get used to it, get comfortable with it. There's no basis to decide. In the absence of independent, non-relative bases for establishing moral truth, we're left with the assertion that there are no objective moral truths, and therefore there are no moral obligations, at least no true moral obligations, just the obligations that you adopt or that your society acknowledges and imposes or that your culture adheres to and expects members to adhere to. If there are no objective moral truths, relativism tells us further that the best available option is merely our opinion about ethics. That is, your belief about what's right, my belief about what's right, my society's beliefs about what's right, your society's beliefs about what's right, and so forth. Now here we run into a bit of a problem because even relativists disagree exactly how this works. So it could be the case, as some relativists argue, that what we need to do is take the aggregate of current opinions about what's right or what's wrong. So we don't take any one particular individual, say the president of the country or the leader of the society or the imam or the pope, to take their opinion as determinative, but rather we should take the aggregate of current opinions. And then this allows for the societies or the communities or the individuals' opinions to change, so we can allow a temporal time slice in here. Other moral relativists argue that no, what we need to do is take the majority opinion. So what we have would be ethics almost by poll or by a majority opinion, not unlike what we have in politics. I'll leave you to determine whether that's a good thing or not. So why would people think that relativism is an appealing position to take? Well, most people, when you ask them why they're reluctant to claim or assert that there are moral truths, many answer, the most common answer, is that they believe that that would allow for tolerance, especially for tolerance of diversity. So people recognize in a society like ours that there are differences of opinion, there are differences of beliefs, differences of values, and different faiths and cultures and so forth, all intermingling. And so the best way to respect people's differences is to not assert or claim or hold any one belief or one value or one tradition or one set of customs to be true and correct. And so relativism is a nice, appealing alternative. And that allows me to say, well, you have your beliefs and I have my beliefs. You live your life according to your beliefs and I will live my life according to my beliefs. So according to relativism, ethical truth is relative to something. And we cannot adjudicate between whatever those somethings are without invoking a particular opinion about ethics, which is exactly what relativism rejects. There are several variations of relativism, and those variations accrue to whatever the something is that moral truth is deemed relative to. So what are the truth-making somethings that we can identify? And here we're going to talk about three. We've already seen this to some extent in the previous chapter, but we'll go through it a little bit more detailed here. So here are three possible truth-making somethings. Cultural relativism, where moral truth is relative to culture. So on this view, moral truth is established by culturally adopted and justified ethical standards. And here we have the position that allows for different cultures to offer different models of what is ethical. So for example, Canada compared with the United States on abortion or on gay marriage or on healthcare. In each of those three areas, Canada and the United States have very different opinions about what the moral status is of abortion, whether it's permissible and under what conditions, whether gay marriage should be permissible and under what conditions, and what health care should be as a right or as something that you acquire on the market. So two countries, even very similar countries, can have extremely different views on the moral status of certain activities and conduct. And that's what cultural relativism allows. Now, do you want to say Canada's wrong and the United States is right on the issue of abortion or gay marriage or health care? Well, if you want to be able to say that, ethical relativism is not your approach, because ethical relativism would actually rule out that judgment between Canada and the US or between any two countries. Ethical relativism holds that what is good for Canada is good for Canada, and if that's different than what is good for the US, then there's no basis to decide whether Canada's good is correct or the US's good is correct, or whether one's better than the other, and which and how. Of course, the only position from which we could make judgments like that would have to be relative to something else. So from the point of view of the United States, Canada may look fundamentally misguided and wrong, but from the point of view of Canada, the United States might look fundamentally misguided and wrong. And ethical relativism says that's perfectly fine, and that's pretty much how it's going to be. To each his own is sort of the motto that you can invoke on this view. The second kind of relativism that we find is called ethical conventionalism. And what we find there is that moral truth is relative to conventions. Now, we talked about this in the previous lecture a little bit with social conventions, and so here it appears again. Moral truth is established by the conventions of the society or the group, and so where you have different groups, those different groups offer different models of what is ethical. For example, the Tri-Delt sorority values academic excellence and models good conduct accordingly, while the Tri-Kappas value social engagement and models good conduct accordingly. Are the Tri-Deltas correct and the Tri-Kappas incorrect? Is the ethical system of the Tri-Kappas better than the ethical system of the Tri-Deltas? Again, ethical relativism would tell us that that kind of question is incoherent. Ethical subjectivism. Now here is where things get really interesting. On this view, moral truth is relative to individual beliefs. Here it's the subject, the individual, who establishes moral truth on the basis of her or his beliefs and values. So different individuals offer different models of what is ethical. For example, Fred values trust and models good behavior accordingly, while Sandy values satisfying her own desires as she walks off with Fred's iPad. I'll let you sort that one out. So what you get is the idea that within an individual's principles, values, and ideals change over time, experience, and reflection, and so we shouldn't be surprised that what is deemed to be right or wrong by that individual changes accordingly over time and with experience and with reflection. So what are some of the problems with relativism? Well, most people accept ethical relativism because they mistakenly believe that it supports tolerance of diversity, even tolerance of ethical differences. However, tolerance is not a universally accepted principle. Not every society has valued tolerance. Think about Nazi Germany. Think about pre-Civil War United States. Tolerance was not something that was universally accepted, nor was tolerance believed in either of those societies to be a value that applies to everyone. It applies, if at all, only to some within those societies. So if tolerance isn't a universally accepted principle, it applies only to those whose ethical opinions include respect for tolerance. So if your belief system includes tolerance but mine doesn't, then it makes no sense for you to say, hey, be tolerant. And I would then say, well, but no, I don't, tolerance isn't one of my values, so no. And relativism would say, that's fine, get used to it. You might be tempted to say respect for tolerance is an objective principle which should be adopted by all societies and all individuals, but that's a non-relative assertion. You need some other approach to ethics than relativism to be able to make that claim persuasively. Another problem with relativism has to do with the denial of an independent basis for moral judgment. As many of you will know from your own professions and your own careers, interference with others may sometimes be justified. And here I'm thinking, for example, actions toward others that include child abuse, animal torture, genocide, or actions toward oneself like smoking, suicide, gambling, drinking, drug use. These are all instances in which we may be justified, and rightfully so, in interfering with someone's actions or conduct in order to protect others or to help them protect themselves or not harm themselves. But relativism would deny this. We're left with the ethically troubling consequences that lead us to say, well, don't judge or interfere or stop me, even if my actions harm you or someone else. There's no basis, no ethical basis for that kind of intervention. Another problem with relativism is that it renders ethical judgments as merely expressions of opinion without a way to evaluate which opinion is worth relying on. And it shifts the focus from the ethical value and status of my conduct to what our opinions are, your opinion, my opinion, our opinions are about that conduct. So for example, you can get a statement like, genocide is not really wrong, you only think it is because your values don't include it. And relativism allows no coherent response to that. And so the result is that ethical language loses its meaning, its motivational force, and its connection to conduct. The lack of consensus, however, does not entail an absence of moral truth, and it's at this point that we want to consider an alternative to ethical relativism, and that is what is often referred to as ethical objectivism. This is the view that holds there are some objectively true ethical standards and values. The problem we have is knowing what those are. And so what kind of evidence do ethical objectivists appeal to? Well, they say, look, historically, the tendency is for societies to become more ethical as they develop, expand, and become more inclusive of others. For example, the elimination of slavery or the forceful end of genocide in Nazi Germany. We have lots of historical examples where societies become more moral. There's sort of moral progress that we can note over the course of history within a particular society and even within a particular individual. And so if that's the case, then maybe it's not the case, as relativists suggest, that there is no basis for deciding between opinions about ethics. It's clear that not all opinions are equally supported by the evidence. One of the main opinions that supported the institution of slavery was that Africans and their descendants, who were then African Americans, were not fully human. That was even included in the U.S. Constitution in terms of assessing the vote. But clearly that's just false on the biological evidence. And so that opinion is less valid, less worth listening to, less in terms of the justification that it provides for any ethical positions or moral positions or conduct guidance that's proposed on the basis of those falsehoods. So not all opinions are equal, and that's the view that ethical objectivism holds. Some opinions are better than others. The trouble is that we have to figure out how to make that determination. And so they also note that the ethical variation that relativism identifies actually is in our conduct, but if we look at a more deep level, if we look past the conduct, we actually find that there's considerable convergence on principles and values. For example, respect seems to be a universally adopted value. Just about every human society in history has had some principle like the principle of respect. The difference is, and the disagreement is, on what conduct actually shows it. Shaking your hand, looking into your eyes, averting your eyes, not shaking your hand, bowing, these are all different ways in which people can show respect to someone, but what it looks like to someone who's not looking more deeply is that you've got different conduct. People disagree. Should I shake his hand? No. Should I shake his hand? Yes. Well, gosh, there's moral disagreement on how we should behave to others. Ethical objectivists would say, well, no, there's not disagreement about how we should behave toward others. We should behave respectfully. The difference comes in what actions are identified as demonstrating that kind of respect. So what can serve as the basis for truth in ethics? Well, we need something which is universal or nearly universal, which is the true making something for ethical standards, the objectivist says. And historical candidates have included reason, utility, consequences, happiness, well-being, liberty, among many, many others. Now there are, of course, some problems with objectivism. Often what we have is no more than the appearance of objectivity. In monocultural societies, it's easy to adopt social conventions as an apparently true basis for ethics. So where there's no... historically, we live in a very unique kind of country, which is comprised of immigrants who have come together peacefully to live together, among one another. Historically, that's not the case. Historically, societies have been dominated by a particular group, or they've pushed into another group's territory and pushed that other group out. And so they seem to be all in agreement because they all have the same set of cultural norms and cultural expectations and traditions and customs. And so it's easy to adopt, in that kind of context, our social conventions as the truth about what's right and what's wrong. Similarly, in religious communities, it's easy to adopt religious requirements as an apparently true basis for ethics, because we all believe the same thing and it's deeply and fundamentally true for all of us, and our experience and our faith confirms it. It's easy to then assume that what we identify as right and good really is right and good truly. Even in modern complex societies as diverse religiously, culturally, and traditionally as ours is, it's easy to adopt something like the law as a standard of truth for ethics. And we saw in the previous chapter the problem of using both religion and law and social conventions as the basis for ethics. So to adopt one particular cultural, religious, or customary perspective as the source of truth for our ethical standards risks alienating those whom one serves, but who also then disagree or don't share your perspective. You risk a loss of trust or respect, and you're seen as someone who imposes your standards on others. Your clients or the public's rejection of the decisions, policies, or actions taken on the basis of that perspective is something you also risk. And you also risk the appearance of or the actual denial of service to clients or the public on the basis of the particular ethical perspective you adopt. And those are risks that we want to avoid. All right, what are the implications for professionals of this discussion? Well, avoiding these risks is crucial for professionals and public servants. Our interactions with others must be respectful and respectful of the potential for ethical differences and disagreement. However, we also want to seek convergence on some basic ethical standards. We also have to avoid adopting any one particular perspective as the basis for guiding our action and our conduct, and for recommending guidance for the conduct of others, because many of us as professionals do make recommendations for how others should act. If you're someone who wants to go into social work, you'll probably be spending a lot of time doing that. If you're someone who wants to become a police officer or who is a police officer, you'll be spending a lot of time recommending guidance for the conduct of others. So what are the implications of this? Then we have to be able to establish some set of minimal ethical standards on which we can all agree as professionals and public servants, which requires professionals and public servants to be transparent with regard to their ethical standards. That's going to be hugely significant. It must be the case that your client and the public know what your ethical standards are, and that you're open and transparent with what they are. These minimal standards must be oriented toward the public good and the socially recognized objectives of the particular profession or public service at issue. All right, wrapping up. In modern, complex, and diverse societies, finding consensus on ethics is a challenge. This should be apparent from Learning Module 1. Relativism and Objectivism are both unappealing positions to take with regard to finding an ethical approach to professional and public service. Some convergence on standards, values, and principles is possible, though. We must have consistent minimal standards. Perhaps these would be limited in scope to those who work in different areas of the public service and in different professions, but it may be that those are also more broadly applicable. We must be transparent to the public and to clients, and we must promote socially justifiable objectives, purposes, and ends. All right, then here's some questions for you to think about. And if you can answer these questions, then wonderful. You've done a great job. If not, please review. Thank you very much.